What first drew you to Calvin Coolidge?
Calvin Coolidge is a very important historical figure, transformational really because of the time that he happened upon the office of the presidency by accident because of the death of the president that he was elected with. The progressive era began, according to historians now, in hindsight, in 1896 and ended in 1920. That's the election that brought Harding and Coolidge to office in what was the greatest popular vote landslide in a century. It was a departure from, and a deliberate departure from, the policies of the last several years in the Wilson administration, which had by 1920 produced results that progressivism and the progressive era did not anticipate. Things like the income tax, which was brand new in 1913, and prohibition, both ideals of progressivism. We were thinking that prohibition would solve many social ills, that it would reduce crime and corruption. Instead of solving those problems, of course, it created new ones. The government's capacity to enforce it was nowhere near what it would have needed to be. Even these days, you could imagine how next to impossible it would be to enforce such a thing. But there were ambitions in the 1910s that progressives were testing, essentially. The income tax started out 1913, brand new, as a progressive alternative to the tariff, so that the little guy wouldn't have to pay it, because with the tariff those costs are passed through and it's really regressive and everybody ends up having to pay. But the income tax was going to be different. It started out with a 6% top rate, and you didn't begin to pay it until you made $15 million or more, adjusted for today's currency. By the time Coolidge comes along in 1920, the top rate of income tax was 73%. The impact of these progressive policies on middle-class lives was very different than progressive theory would have had it, and Coolidge came along and corrected for all of that. He was a change agent in many ways, and he calmed down and pacified America for what amounted to the better part of a decade.
So what is the theme for your remarks at the conference today?
So we were talking about the progressive era, which, as I said, more or less is bookended by 1896 to 1920. And I mentioned a couple things. One is that the race policies in the Wilson administration came to define progressivism, and yet today we would not think of them as anywhere near progressive policies, just the opposite. Whereas Coolidge, starting in 1907, was voting for women's suffrage, which Wilson did not support even at the state level till 1915. Wilson did not drop his opposition to the Susan B. Anthony Amendment until the last years of his second term in the White House. On race, he appointed many white supremacists to his cabinet. They segregated the federal workforce. Wilson himself defended these policies in public. It was a very, very difficult period for race relations in America, such that by 1920, again, that pivotal year, we had race riots that had been running wild in the country for 3 years. And really importantly, all of these riots, almost every one of them, was instigated by white vigilantes attacking black men and women. So this was the denial of law enforcement in black Americans' neighborhoods because they were not given equal protection of the law. Coolidge came along, went out of his way to make an address at Howard University and condemned this propaganda of prejudice and hate, things that we would expect a president to do these days. But in the moment, it would have been really good for Woodrow Wilson to have done that, but he did not.
Right. Is there anything important about Coolidge that you may not have had a chance to say in your public remarks that you want to mention?
Well, Coolidge is just endlessly fascinating because all of us who learned about Coolidge in school learned about Silent Cal and all the jokes that were told, some of them apocryphal. The one that is most often repeated that is apocryphal, in other words, it didn't happen, but it's still such a good story. Everybody tells it is that he was sitting next to a woman at dinner who said, I had a bet that I couldn't get 2 words out of you. And he said to her, you lose, and then didn't speak to her for the rest of the dinner. He was obviously a little more brief than some of our very loquacious presidents. Bill Clinton comes to mind, or people that can talk a blue streak and do a pretty good job of it. So I'm sure, none of us was alive, I didn't ever meet him. I'm sure that there's some truth behind that, even though it's not so extreme. But the reason I think he's so fascinating is that he was anything but a caricature. The things that he stood for, the things that he did, were just so vitally important at the moment. Harding, who he replaced as president, his administration was beset by scandal. So in the same way, analogously to Gerald Ford coming after Richard Nixon, our long national nightmare is over, and so on. It wasn't quite as long a national nightmare as a year and a half or something of Harding, but Coolidge, by account of all historians of whatever ideological stripe, restored integrity to the office in the White House because he was honest and he didn't have any scandal.
Yeah. Did you learn anything at the conference so far that you feel needs to be emphasized during Coolidge's centennial year?
Oh my gosh, yes. And the thing that, above all, you learn is that Coolidge was really a fusionist ideologically. He had progressive ideals. So all of the things that we think about when we think about progressivism, standing up for the rights of working people and the dignity of work, and support for labor and labor unions. These were objectives at race, which today we expect to be progressive, but as I say, was not. All of these things were aims of Calvin Coolidge. Ultimately, he decided that putting responsibility for all of these things in the hands of the central government, which is also the default progressive solution, was not his approach to solving these problems, but his laundry list of things to do was very much the progressive list. And so in that sense, he very nicely bridged the 1910s and took us through the 1920s.